We'd like to say hello to everyone at the conference and thank you for inviting us to give our presentation from San Diego, California. My name is Tatiana Berger. I teach in the graduate program at the New School of Architecture and Design in San Diego and at the Compostela Institute in Santiago de Compostela, Spain. I'm also a practicing architect and an urban designer. I worked in the office of Álvaro Siza in Portugal until 2004 and in architecture and engineering firms in Bregenz, Moscow, and New York. The New School is the first design school in the U.S. to offer a certificate and a one-year master's program in neuroscience for architecture. We're currently developing a new interdisciplinary educational curriculum with a focus on human experience of the built environment, together with scientists from the Salk Institute of Biological Studies and UCSD, and with the support of the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture.
Hello, I'm Sergey Gepshtein. I'm a scientist. I work in the areas of sensory-motor psychophysics and systems neuroscience. I study human perception and action from the mechanistic point of view of neurobiology and from a point of view that respects visual experience as a research focus in its own right. In addition to my basic research, I serve on the board of the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, whose mission is to deepen our understanding of human response to the built environment. In that capacity, I'm helping to develop a new educational curriculum connecting human sciences and architecture at the New School in San Diego. Recently, I also joined faculty of the School of Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. There I established the Center for Spatial Perception and Concrete Experience. The center offers a multidisciplinary platform for investigating experience of space as a sequential narrative process. Let me start by making a distinction between two broad conceptions of space, which we will call the space of experience and space of intellect. The French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty anticipated this distinction yet in 1948 in his introduction to Phenomenology on French radio, where he distinguished between what he called the space of classical science, which is the uniform medium in which things are arranged in three dimensions and in which they remain the same regardless of the position they occupy. It is a medium of simultaneous objects capable of being apprehended by an absolute observer who is equally close to them all, a medium without point of view, without body, and without spatial position. In sum, the medium of pure intellect. And this is against the space of experience, for which he noted that our relationship to space is not that of a pure, disembodied subject to a distant object, but rather that of a being which dwells in space relating to its natural habitat. Merleau-Ponty observed that, paradoxically, the world of experience seems at first sight to be the one we know best of all, for we need neither to measure nor to calculate in order to gain access to this world, and it would seem that we can fathom it simply by opening our eyes and getting on with our lives. Yet, this is a delusion. The world of perception is, to a great extent, unknown territory, as long as we remain in the practical or utilitarian attitude. That is, when we need to shape it to our needs, as the case is in architectural and urban design. Since the time Merleau-Ponty pointed to this gaping hole in our understanding of experience, certain progress has been made in investigating both intellectual and experiential species of space. I would like to describe this progress against the broader context of spatial concepts on a continuum between those concepts that describe reality in purely objective, observer-independent terms at left, and those concepts that describe the so-called socially constructed reality in terms that are either subjective or established by intersubjective social convention at right. Moving from left to right on this arc, we find different kinds of space. First, it is physical space, associated with geometry, mechanics, theory of relativity, and similar. Then there is physiological space, concerned, for example, with the representation of space in the brain, studied by neuroscience, then with sensitivity to spatial layout and movement, studied by sensory-motor psychophysics, then with perception of spatial layout, its meaning and value, studied by perceptual psychology, and with cognitive maps, studied by cognitive psychology. We could sum up these concepts in terms of larger classes of sensory, motoric or active, and affective or emotive concepts of space. While previous concepts mix theoretical and experiential aspects of space, the next step of phenomenological space has experience as its exclusive focus. This branch was launched by the extraordinary mind of Franz Brentano, whose best-known heirs include Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger in Germany and the just mentioned Merleau-Ponty in France. These concepts divide to the realms of conceptual study, which we could call the philosophical phenomenological branch, and the experimental branch, promulgated by several schools of Gestalt psychology in Germany, Italy, and beyond. Further, there are instrumental concepts of space developed for practical ends, for communication, as in linguistics, for constructing visual representations, as in painting, for design of spatial environments, as in theater, architecture, and urban design. And finally, there are poetic concepts of space that convey spatial ideas and literature and theory of art, for example, in literary criticism, where Mikhail Bakhtin developed his notion of chronotopos, and in architectural criticism, where Gaston Bachelard developed his poetics of space. On this continuum, the division between space of intellect and space of experience, enunciated by Merleau-Ponty, falls somewhere here, to which we find interesting parallels in architectural thought.
One of the fundamental problems faced by contemporary architecture is excessive emphasis on the scenographic, conceptual, symbolic aspects of architectural meaning, all part of what Merleau-Ponty called the space of classical sciences, and what we're calling here the space of intellect. This practice of reducing architecture to aesthetic sculptural objects is driven by highly speculative theories of architecture that are no longer relevant for individual and collective life. We have become disconnected from the environment and from each other, relinquishing our innate ability for orientation and active participation in the shaping of space and culture. I've chosen for the last two slides work created by Rem Koolhaas and Peter Eisenman. As Alvaro Siza recently said to me, architecture without people becomes sculpture. Voices in our profession call for closer attention to the concrete, embodied aspects of experience and to the multisensory apprehension of space, light, sound, and form. In his essay, Towards an Ontological Architecture, a Philosophical Excursus, which appears in the book shown here, Kenneth Frampton reminds us that the expression of architecture as a building craft should come from an understanding of the body itself. Frampton writes, "Architecture is consummated by the body being at both a sensuous and a referential level, rather than as an aesthetic manifestation that is exclusively visual and abstract." While there's a rich potential in experiential qualities of space, we lack the training and a methodology to fully understand the space of experience and to design for the dimension of time. It's helpful at this point to look back to ideas about space and empathy in this important book, translated by Harry Mulgrave and Eleftherios Economou. One of the first theorists to insist on a spatial approach in the study of architecture was August Schmarsow. In his essay of 1893 titled The Essence of Architectural Creation, he writes, "Every spatial creation is first and foremost the enclosing of a subject, and thus architecture as a human art differs fundamentally from all endeavors in the applied arts." End quote. The individual is able to create architecture, Schmarsow thinks, because of his sense of space and spatial imagination. We might say that architectural space is an expression of the body. Is there a reciprocal relationship between the body and space? Schmarsow insists on empathy between the artist and observer. He writes, "What is truly essential can only start in the mind of the artist and end in the mind of the observer." The author sees the human subject not as a passive reflection of his context, but as an active agent who can complete the space around according to his imagination and has the power to change himself and the world around him. These are potentially revolutionary ideas for architecture. All of these ideas can reinvigorate our contemporary thinking about space. Let's review several case studies of architecture which engages spatial imagination and includes action and movement as an essential component of the spatial experience. Le Corbusier was one of the first modern architects to envision a new concept of space generated with the architectural promenade, and he employs a variety of tools to articulate dynamic space. Moving along the ramp in Villa Savoye, the observer fuses with the space, which changes according to the positioning of the body. Many of Le Corbusier's ideas about the potential of the temporal body as the driving force in space and of experience were never fully analyzed. Frank Lloyd Wright's spiraling ramp in the Guggenheim in New York City carves the space of the museum to facilitate movement and gathering, placing the individuals at the center of the experience. Álvaro Siza's Ibera Camargo Museum in Porto Alegre, Brazil, is organized with its ramps wrapping around the building and guiding visitors in an experience which joins the building and the landscape. In all of these examples, movement is not only a component of the spatial experience, but is also a form-generating principle. Today's sciences have given us the tools to understand the human body, brain, behavior, and how the built environment affects the user's experience. Sergei will show in his next part how methods from science can help to reveal the hidden structure of experiential fields and help us to predict sequences of experiences.
Now, let us take a closer look at the space of experience. We have considered the fact that there are multiple concepts of space, represented schematically as an arc, dominated by abstract and mechanistic ideas at left, and concerned with life experience at right, separated by a fuzzy boundary. In the interest of time, we will focus on this boundary alone. Two scientific disciplines have approached this boundary from the opposite sides. Psychophysics from the mechanistic side at left, we'll say about it more later, and experimental phenomenology from the experiential side, the latter rising from a streak in the phenomenological tradition that sought to ground itself in a scientific methodology. Experimental phenomenology started with the previously noted Gestalt school of psychology early in the 20th century. One of the fundamental ideas of Gestalt psychology was that of psychological field, like in the figure at right, where you can see a sharp white triangle created by field-like interactions between multiple parts. To illustrate the idea of psychological field, let us consider how a Gestalt-trained psychologist of art, Rudolf Arnheim, thinks of architectural space in this remarkable book called The Dynamics of Architectural Form. Arnheim used the diagram from Paolo Portoghesi at right in which the built environment is represented in the plan view by the thick lines, and the thin concentric circles represent the effects of these walls on the person. Arnheim points out that the spaces surrounding buildings cannot be considered empty. Instead, these spaces are pervaded by visual forces generated by the architectural structures. He says further that visual forces should be understood as components of perceptual fields that surround buildings. He talks about these forces as dynamical processes that expand from their sources and propagating as if they had wavefronts, as if they had quantifiable strength. Evidently, Arnheim uses the terms of force and field metaphorically. In his hands, these terms are devoid of scientific meaning because it is unclear how the referred entities can be measured and how the proposed structure of experience can be validated. Let me propose next how this sort of thinking can be implemented in scientifically valid terms. Psychophysical studies led to formulating a number of laws of perception, however, in highly restricted laboratory conditions. This work predicted in great detail how our ability to acquire sensory information depends on the viewing distance. In particular, visibility is expected to reduce at long and short distances from the object, even as the fall of visibility at short viewing distances appears to be paradoxical. To appreciate effects of this law of perception, consider a plan view of space in which the star at right represents some objects of each of interest. The line represents an observer trajectory. Given the just mentioned law of visibility, we can predict that the object will be visible within a limited range of distances, not too far from the object and not too close to it. In other words, visibility of this object is confined to an envelope, which in the plan view has the shape of a ring or annulus. The object is visible where the line overlaps the ring. Now consider another object represented by this white star. This second object will be visible from a range of distances represented by this lighter ring, and for observer moving along this curved trajectory, there are two segments here and here where the object will be visible. We can readily find an intersection of these two rings, like this, discovering a region of space where both objects could be seen at the same time. This simple model is an example of translating psychophysical laws from the restricted laboratory conditions to conditions of immersive experience for a person moving freely on any path in this space. In the paper accompanying this talk, we will describe a study funded by the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, where a scientist, an architect, and narrative designer tested predictions of this model. The study was carried out at the Architectural Robotics Laboratory at UCLA. We validated predictions of the model of how visibility of visual features depends on the viewing distance. Now, notice that the boundaries of experience in this model result from biological limitations of the person. These boundaries are spatial manifestations of the person's body. In other words, we are talking about what the philosopher of mind or the phenomenologist would call an embodied space, in sharp contrast to the notion of space between buildings that is empty from intellectual or physical standpoint. In this illustration of embodied space, we have transcended the layer of philosophical reflection and added a layer of concreteness, a specific predicted structure for analysis of experience that is open to scientific validation and practical application.
As we've just discussed, the space surrounding the body is not neutral or empty. It's a charged and ever-changing sensory field shared by the body and the built environment. The sensory field encourages multisensory perceptions by the observer, perceptions which all lead to an embodied appreciation of space and atmosphere. We might think of the field as a mechanism which permits this to happen. The Japanese idea of space, for example, is one that operates outside of the single-point perspective. Each object contributes to the field of the garden. A walk through a forest is an example of complete engagement with the world. The experience is multisensory in its very essence, but it also involves perception beyond the five senses, such as the sensations of orientation, gravity, balance, duration, and stability, most of which are perceived only through movement. In fact, one could speak of a series of senses that are awakened by movement and that architects in our time simply don't know how to design for. Alvar Aalto designed this staircase in the Villa Mairea in Finland in a manner that continues and honors the landscape. The wood posts, reminiscent of the nearby forest, lead the visitor on a sensory experience where gravity, measure, material texture, and smell all play a role. These individual sensory motor capacities are themselves embedded in a more encompassing biological, psychological, and cultural context, a symbiosis of body and culture. We could complement our discussion of sensory field to include an understanding of aura in architecture. Just as the rings in the model of visibility convey sensory impact of the object on the perceiver, an aura in architectural discourse conveys the impact of an object on a person over distance. Walter Benjamin had a lot to say about aura in his work, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction of 1936. He wrote, "We define aura as the unique phenomenon of a distance, however close it may be," and went on to define aura as a presence in time and space. Schmarza imagined what we call a sensory field in the following way. The intuited form of space which surrounds us wherever we may be consists of the residues of sensory experience to which the muscular sensations of our body, the sensitivity of our skin, and the structure of our body all contribute. One of the key insights from Schmarza, the idea that architecture does not belong to the fine arts, but is a building or tectonic art, is illustrated in the highly sensitive haptic drawings of Carlo Scarpa, which articulate tectonic detail. In Scarpa's Chirini Stampala Museum of Art in Venice, the changing textures and colors, sound of water, smell and airflow, landscape boundaries, and other elements all define space, encourage exploration, and seem to reach out to the senses. These elements are understood with the whole body, and space is changing in every moment by the movement of the body. Louis Kahn's famous Salk Institute in La Jolla, which happens to be one of the sites for this recording, and the previous examples show us how space can be articulated by the built environment. Adjacent locations offer the person different experiences and sensory motor affordances, thus creating a continuous field. What is the potential of a sensory field in architecture? Peter Zumter's project for the thermal baths at Vals in Switzerland offers an illustration. A sensory field is suggested by the spatial structure in this sketch plan. Fields, by their very nature, encourage movement and invite exploration by the observer. We have to remember that perception also involves the movement of the body. In this building, we never see the entire structure or a dominant form at once, but we sense it gradually over time with our body through the texture, temperature, and color of the stone, the sound of water, the overall ambience. Here's what Zumter wrote about the building. Moving around this space means making discoveries. You're walking as if in the woods. The stone rooms were designed not to compete with the body, but to flatter the human form and give it space, room in which to be." End quote. In summary, the scientific line of thought presented by Sergei and the line of thought I just described bring us to the same conclusion. Space of experience can only be understood by recognizing that the perceiver is a freely moving individual. Because of the movement, the experience of space is always sequential. It forms a spatio-temporal structure, which we're only beginning to understand. All in all, it appears that the architectural profession needs to bring the full-blooded human being into its very core. In this brief talk, we begin tracing the contours of an investigation that attempts to do just that. Sooner or later, human sciences and other research disciplines will intertwine with every step of architectural and urban design. Here we've concentrated on the sciences concerned with the concepts of space. No doubt these concepts have always been part of design, but they were recognized as central to architecture only in the late 19th century. We suggested how spatial thought in architecture could use elements of scientific exploration, which implies that we carefully separate intellectual and experiential species of space. This way, we begin uncovering the hitherto hidden structure of space of experience, for which mobility is an essential condition.
As this work evolves, it will concern the macroscopic structure of experience, illustrated here by a much simplified model of the field of experience, and also its microscopic fabric, which follows naturally from the same research that gave us the original model. As the profession moves from the abstract, object-oriented design to humanistic, experience-driven design, here we have described an attempt to advance studies of experience towards specific tools that can be used in practice. In the following written article, we will detail further steps in this investigation and illustrate how the architect could use explicit knowledge about boundaries of experience in the process of design. This is just one illustration of how space can be conceived in a framework that puts human experience in its center. We suspect that pursuing this line of inquiry will amount to a new discipline that will be as different from purely scientific practice as it is from traditional architectural practice.
Thanks so much for listening to our lecture, and please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions.